Pull up my notes. All right, we're live. Another episode.
Excellent.
Of Monero Talk. We got Articmine, or what's the real name? It's Francisco
Cabanas.
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 And what's the handle mean? Does it have any meaning?
Originally, it had a meaning.
Okay.
The meaning was I was living in Prince George. I was buying Bitcoin in the middle of the winter. The process in Canada meant you go to a bank, you withdraw, say, $200, and then you go to another bank and deposit it into the exchange. You do that in minus 30 to minus 20 weather. By the time I get home, my hands are freezing. I stick them behind the mining to warm up. So I basically had my computer, so GPU mining for Bitcoin at the time. And so I would warm up my hands by sticking it behind a Bitcoin mine.
That's a good story.
Yeah, so that's where I came up with the concept.
Do you still mine?
Very seldom.
Okay.
Mostly a buyer, holder, some trading, but mostly buy and hold.
So you started in Bitcoin, and then how did you transition over to Monero?
Monero. Oh, okay. I started in Bitcoin in 2011. That was in the fall of 2011. Then those days you could buy a Bitcoin for like $5, $2, $3, that kind of stuff. And I approached it from the perspective of, I'm an investor, how can it fail? So I spent an incredible amount of time studying Bitcoin and looking at its strengths. And I found one weakness, scaling. This thing does not scale. You had a hard fork in order so people can use it. By 2014, I was doing research on Bitcoin scaling. I came across Monero. Totally by chance, I posted on Bitcoin Talk. I said, okay, fine, I'm going to take a look at this. I used to be a Bitcoin maximalist. Not into altcoins at all.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a look at this. So I spent some time looking at it. My due diligence was, does it scale? Oh, yes, it does. Oh, yes, they've solved this problem. They don't realize it, but they have. This is really interesting. So I started doing my research on Monero. And then I started basically buying Monero with my Bitcoins.
When did you come across Monero? In the very early?
Very early, 2014. And I think it was about May, June 2014.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's one of the very early posts. I started buying that summer with Bitcoin. And then I spent more time researching Monero. By the fall, I spent some time doing some analysis for the core team at the time with respect to the, they wanted to change the emission curve, which was a non-starter. But I did some analysis for that. Did a fair amount of buying during the bottom of the bear market. And by about middle of 2015, I realized that I had to get out of Bitcoin, that Bitcoin wasn't going to go anywhere because of the scaling issue. And I had to be somewhere where it would scale and where we work in the future. When
you say the scaling issue, what are you referring to exactly?
I'm referring
the block size?
I'm referring to the simple fact that Bitcoin has a hardcore coded block size that limits its growth, and that's hard-coded into the protocol. Furthermore, you cannot really change this because you have to go to very core elements of the protocol. In order to make it viable, you kind of have to look at increasing the maximum number of coins. Well, that is a major violation of the social covenant of Bitcoin. But the problem is, this is being repeated in Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash, Dash, pretty well every major proof of work cryptocurrency. Even Ethereum Classic went ahead and they moved away from a fixed minimum block reward to a fixed number of coins, creating the same problem there. So Zcash has the same problem. Pretty well everybody's gone into this thing, go back to the Satoshi paper, and they said this fee market is going to emerge out of nowhere and solve this problem. And there's no evidence that I have seen that justifies this. I've seen a fair amount of evidence that says that it can't happen or has this or that problem.
So what, before we keep proceeding, because obviously you have a very good understanding of the architecture and how things scale. What is your background before you even got into Bitcoin itself?
I did a degree in physics, a PhD in physics, and my undergraduate degree is in physics and mathematics.
Okay, and you have some programming skills as well.
And I am self-taught. I mean, I started programming in the 70s with punch cards and Fortran, assembler. So I'm self-taught programmer, basically, because in those days you have to learn how to code on your own. It wasn't even taught in university,
right,
to a large degree. It's something that you learn at work, kind of thing.
Right.
So I have a lot of that experience from coding from that perspective. I don't do a lot of coding, more advice in this sense, but I understand all the concepts. Gotcha. Like I said, I basically, my background in programming is Fortran and assembler.
So when you came across Monero, I mean, so you read the crypto note white paper, and then what was your thinking there when you?
I read
was Monero designed to overcome some of the? Was it designed for that purpose, to overcome the shortcomings of Bitcoin? Was that kind of your feeling?
Now, Monero. Let me clarify here. CryptoNote and the CryptoNote block paper, for example, Bitcoin does not fully overcome this shortcoming in Bitcoin, and the reason is they still stuck with the maximum number of coins. It is the modification to CryptoNote that Monero did, which is to introduce this minimum tail emission of 1%, just under 1%. That's right, it's 0.6 Monero per block, that makes the whole thing viable. Without the tail emission, the adaptive block size limit, the CryptoNote adaptive block size limit, will fail and the coin will become insecure. In fact, that's what my research has been involved in the Monero project essentially has shown to me.
So I didn't realize that. So CryptoNote had the adaptive block size, but it didn't have the tail emission component?
That's correct. The tail emission component was introduced by Monero. And that's a critical, and it was a very strong foresight. I have a lot of credit to the early core team, because I wasn't involved in this at all, that they came up with this. Because this makes Monero viable.
And now, so you weren't involved in that process at all, or you kind of watched? Okay,
I was not involved. I mean, I was even at the time hadn't even realized it was necessary myself. I even questioned it at one point. But it was explained to me. Javier Smooth, for example, great. He explained to me, no, this is why we have to do this. This is needed. And then I started to understand it once I really spent the time looking at the problem, because my involvement in the core team since 2006 in Monero has been primarily on the scaling question and the fee structure. Well, the way the fees are set in Monero, the total fees per block are proportional to the block reward. If the block reward goes to 0, so do the fees. There is no possibility of the Satoshi fee market. That's how scaling works in Monero.
Gotcha. Are there other components that Monero has that the original CryptoNote white paper didn't really talk about in terms of architecture? Like how different is Monero
from original CryptoNote?
Yeah.
Very. I mean, apart from this first key question, then we have confidential transactions or ring confidential transactions. We have, which is not part of CryptoNote. We now have bulletproofs, which is not part of CryptoNote. We have minimum minimum number of rings. This is a Monero innovation, which is not going to become fixed number of rings, not part of CryptoNote. So that's just the start. So there's a lot in Monero. Monero's evolved a lot from the original CryptoNote over this 4-year period.
And so how did you become part of the core team?
I was invited. I was asked to join the core team. I was involved in a lot of postings of Bitcoin Talk on this very issue of scaling. And I also did some work, as I said, for the core team in a couple of other things. Primarily, or initially, was regarding the emission curve analysis. And I was invited to join, and I decided to, yes, so this is something I can do, I can contribute to. I should point out that one of my requirements for being involved in the core team is that Monero be what's called, and I'm quoting FinCEN here, a decentralized virtual currency. By that, I mean there is no pre-mine, there's no founder's reward, there's none of that. It's all an open source project without all the money that goes to the miners and then it gets sold through the mining process. There is no core team control of emission that is then distributed in this or that direction. And that's a very serious and very important regulatory issues, by the way, and risks, which I wasn't prepared to take. So I would not touch anything that's got a minimum, a sort of a fund founders reward, or a pre-mine, or a post-mine, or a mid-mine, or an ICO, this or that nature, or some kind of token sale or whatever. I would not touch that.
Do you consider any other projects fitting into that category other than like Bitcoin?
Bitcoin, Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash actually still meets that criteria. Dogecoin. Actually, Dogecoin is interesting because it actually has a tail emission. So you could retrofit a Monero type scaling onto Dogecoin without drastically changing the social covenant. There's very few. Ethereum Classic might meet that requirement in a sense. But Ethereum it was a big pre-mine, so no. So there's very few projects that meet that. Namecoin.
So that's interesting. So what got you really most excited about Monero was the fact that it seemed to have figured out how to get over the scaling issue.
Absolutely.
But then how about the whole privacy aspect? Because that's really what most people are focused on. Is that something that was core?
It's important, but without scaling, you ain't going to get privacy. And let me give you an example. I mean, current Monero transaction is about 26 times the size of a Bitcoin transaction. Well, the reason you could do this is because you have an adaptive block size limit. And you have the capability to support the privacy infrastructure. You have the capability to support that infrastructure. And if you take that away, well, suddenly, I mean, confidential transactions were developed for Bitcoin. And they're implemented in Monero. CoinJoin was developed for Bitcoin. It's being implemented in Dash. What's the reason why? Well, you don't have the Bitcoin blockchain doesn't have the capability to scale to support this kind of stuff.
Oh, you think it? Well, I guess it's also too because of the kind of the momentum behind Bitcoin and the fact that it can't really pivot, right? It doesn't really have the ability. Whereas like Monero, for example, we're upgrading every 6 months. Do you think that plays a role into it as well?
Yes, it does. But the fundamental problem that Bitcoin has and Monero doesn't have is that it does not have the ability, has not resolved the scaling issue. And you cannot solve it without fundamentally changing the social covenant. So it doesn't have the ability to pivot. It's easy to add something into a consensus which is overwhelmingly supportive of the community. That's why Monero gets away with all these hot folks. Because everything that's been presented strongly enhances the value of Monero to everybody involved. But when you have a situation which you have in Bitcoin, where you have this maximum block reward, sorry, maximum number of coins with a block reward falling, and that's a problem. Well, if you're going to change the 21 million Bitcoin limit, which is what you have to do to address this issue fundamentally, well, that's a non-starter. So you have two groups of people right now in Bitcoin, both of which are very good at pointing out the other side is wrong, because that's easy to do, it's easy to demonstrate, but neither of which can provide a solution.
So I guess what a Bitcoin maximalist would say to you is these aren't issues that you're talking about because the scaling is going to take place on the second layer. So what would be your response? My response
to that is very straightforward. Read the Lightning Network paper. Because it tells you the answer is right in the Lightning Network paper. Go towards the end of the paper, and it says it's talking about blocks about 133 megabytes under ideal conditions for Lightning Network. Now, I would say the second layer might give you a factor of 10 or 20, maybe. It ain't going to give you, it's not going to solve the whole scaling issue, but you need scaling to support Lightning Network. Otherwise, how do you close the channels?
Right. And then, I mean, a question I had to Samsung Galaxy Player, and it's actually when he recommended I talk to you.
Yes.
Was if eventually the block reward runs out on Bitcoin, right?
Yes.
There is no tail emission.
Yes.
And if the idea is going to be that transactions are going to be taking place on the second layer, so then there's going to be little mining reward from transactions that essentially how is Bitcoin going to maintain its security if all transactions are taking place on the second layer and there's no transactions taking place on the core protocol layer?
Well, there's no, I don't know. I don't
like
have
what would be the incentive for miners to mine if there's no longer basically if miners will no longer will be receiving transaction fees?
No, they won't be receiving transaction fees, and they won't be receiving a block reward. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that problem.
Is that something that's being talked about? Is that
no? It's the reason I sold my Bitcoins like 3 years ago.
Right.
I'm not kidding you. I'm not standing here. I mean, I made a conscious decision to get out of Bitcoin because of these issues. So I'm not the person to answer that question.
No, I mean, you're speaking to the choir here. I obviously have less of a technical understanding, but it's from reading, basically, I guess, from reading the things you have written on Reddit and things I've read from other people. And that's what's kind of pushed me towards Monero and away from Bitcoin. So do you think it's possible that Lightning might even make more sense on Monero?
Absolutely.
And for those reasons? Absolutely.
And in fact, globally, and this, they're working on a project precisely to do this build these kind of second layer structures. Now, let me say something. I see Lightning as something that's quite useful for certain applications. I'll give you an example where I see a really powerful Lightning application. And that would be where you're making regular payments to somebody else. You open a channel with a merchant, let's say you're on regular payments. That's great. It is not a replacement for scaling. It is a tool, and a very useful one, and actually has some privacy advantages in Monero, because if you make a lot of payments from one person to another, that could actually be attackable from a privacy perspective. So Lightning could actually be very useful in Monero. But it is not a replacement for on-chain scaling.
But you think it will? Do you think it will improve fungibility on Bitcoin?
On Monero, yes.
No, on Bitcoin.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, Bitcoin has more problems than fungibility right now. To be honest, fungibility is a problem because everybody's figured out how to do all of this chain analysis on Bitcoin, which is destroying fungibility on Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Lightning might have some advantages, but I don't see Lightning as a fungibility solution in Bitcoin, primarily because it does involve third parties. People have to open channels, close channels. So there's people you can regulate there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be regulated. I'm not saying that, for example, that Lightning nodes are going to be considered MSBs, but they could be. I mean, it's a gray area. So I'm not sure the fungibility is going to really be a big gain in Bitcoin there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see it. I mean, it'll take some pressure off the main blockchain if they can get the channels to close, but there's the stability of the channels. If you cannot get the channels to close, the whole thing collapses. And that's the problem that concerns me of Lightning on Bitcoin. You don't have that scaling on the underlying chain.
So do you think this is something that's going to start to become, I mean, it's kind of being ignored right now, right? I mean,
very much so.
Yeah. So at what point will everybody kind of open their eyes to that?
Well, I suspect two things are going to happen. The first thing that's going to happen is people have not paid a lot of attention to Monero as a scaling solution. And the reason they haven't done this is because Monero transactions are 26 times the size of a Bitcoin transaction.
Mm-hmm.
So how on earth can this thing scale? It's very easy to shoot it down. This, of course, ignores another important fact, which is when I talk about scaling, I talk about protocol scaling. And by that, I mean I talk about the protocol supporting scaling as opposed to the current technology, because technology has changed a lot. Like, just to give you an idea, in the period of time that the Bitcoin block size debate has been going on, which is 8 years, the bandwidth of user bandwidth has increased by a factor of 26. You can check Nielsen's law.
Wow.
That is the difference in size between a current size Monero transaction and a Bitcoin transaction.
Right. So you're saying that there shouldn't be a concern about scaling on the protocol level.
The concern should be for the protocol, because the protocol needs to support scaling rather than being focused about current technology, because current technology is already changing. The goalposts are moving as we speak. I mean, the goalposts have moved for the last 70, 100 years. And so what's critical, protocols and business models don't change, but technology changes.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason I believe that it hasn't been looked at is because of this huge transaction size. So I think Bulletproofs is going to really bring down the transaction size, and people are going to suddenly realize, wait a minute, Monero can scale. Because then they're going to look at fees are going to go down because transaction sizes go down. So that's going to open the door to this. There's a huge amount of denial because it's not just Bitcoin, it's Litecoin. It's Bitcoin Cash.
Mm-hmm.
It's Dash. There's a whole bunch of other coins that are in the same situation. Zcash. They all have the same problem. Excuse me. It's not just Bitcoin.
So do you think that the fundamentals of Monero will eventually allow it to rise to the top, or do you think we're kind of fighting against the network effect of Bitcoin? And even though Bitcoin has some shortcomings, I guess maybe some people could argue that it's good enough. It's a good enough protocol. And
how can it be a good enough protocol if people can't use it? I mean, it's very basic stuff.
Right.
I mean, the failure level of Bitcoin is very simple. It is people can't use it. Only a small percentage of people can use it. This thing is not going to replace Visa. It's not going to replace any kind of. It's not going to compete. I don't know if I think cryptocurrency will replace. It's not going to compete with these guys because you're limiting the number of transactions per second at a fundamental level. So sooner or later, this is going to catch up. But I don't know when. I cannot say that.
What did you think about Fluffy Pony kind of moving away from core and deciding to concentrate more on second layer stuff like Tari?
Tari is a great project. I can see why, and it's natural evolution. I mean, and it's a healthy thing because I think that Monero, some people might have thought it's getting way too dependent on one person, and you want to spread it out a bit. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a healthy move. A lot of what he's been doing there, I mean, globally, I think has a lot of potential, huge potential, because it's basically the payment infrastructure that never happened in Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a critical, the on-ramps to, and Tari is the same sort of thing. I mean, you're building something on top of the second layer solution. So yeah, I think it's healthy. It's a good evolution, I think. And he's not totally abandoning Monero by any means. He's very involved, but he has to phase out. I think it's a good thing. It's a healthy move. It's a very healthy move, actually.
Do you continue to communicate with these core guys?
Absolutely, on a regular basis. I'm on, we're on all the time dealing with all sorts of things and with other members of the community. I mean, it's an ongoing issue.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things that come up behind the scenes that you have to sort of work on, that are raised, etc.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, just trying to understand the big picture more. At what point do we kind of get? Are we where Monero is what it needs to be? I mean, when are we ever done building the base protocol layer?
I believe eventually we will. I think there's an evolutionary effort with cryptocurrency, just as it's with any type of software. Let me give you an analogy, a historical analogy, a very good one. Take a look at a spreadsheet and take a look at Alpha software. From 1978 to 1998, huge growth in productivity. Last 20 years, virtually none. So with software development, you go through this innovation growth. You get to a point where you've done what you need to do. It starts to flatten out. Mm-hmm. The same thing will happen with Monero. It's very hard to predict as to when it'll happen, but it will happen. You reach a point, an asymptotic point. This is as best as it's going to get. And then it becomes more of a maintenance situation as opposed to a development situation. And I expect that's going to happen with Monero, just as any other type of software.
So do you know what some of the other big things are that need to kind of be tinkered with? I mean,
in Monero right now?
Yeah.
Well, we can start by bulletproofs. We then continue things such as Cavori, the whole IP anonymization and privacy at that level. That's a huge areas that are happening in there. There's a question of daughter chains or side chains in Monero, which I think is a lot of opportunity for that. So that type of protocols. There's some possible ideas of what can be done there, but it's definitely areas for development just off the top of my head. But again, that's going to come from the community. That's going to come from an overall evolutionary process. What I see is it's going to be a trend and it's going to flatten out. Can I predict exactly what's going to be? No, I won't be able to say that.
Could you maybe give us an idea of where you see the scaling going? Because I mean, I hear things like you're saying with like Lightning on top of Monero, but then you also hear things like Mimblewimble as a side chain. I mean, are these like two separate options? Are we going to possibly see all combinations of these things?
I don't see these things primarily as scaling solutions. Lightning has uses quite apart from scaling. Ultimately, what's going to drive scaling in Monero is very simple. It is the crashing cost of bandwidth, digital memory, and computing power. That's what's going to do it. That's what's going to make blockchain viable. And it's outside of the realm of what Monero does. And just to give you an idea, and this is where I think you get the perspective of age. You know, I've got white hair. I'm a 61-year-old baby boomer. Well, I'm old enough to remember when people send telegrams as a normal means of communication, and where you pay like $10, $20 a word, and where you had telegram style, where you actually write to minimize the number of words. And at some point in time in the mid 19th century, it was like $2,000 to send a 10-word message from Britain to the US.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening is we're seeing this falling price of the cost of keeping the ledger, to make it a simple way. Just to give you a more longer term example, I recently, about 20 years ago, I got a friend of mine gave me a 286, which was obsolete at the time, and I've been restoring it lately. It had a 10 megabyte hard drive, which at the time in the 1980s would have cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of 10,000 Canadian dollars. A year ago, I bought a 10 terabyte hard drive to back up blockchains and all, etc., for about 700 Canadian dollars. And this is like high end. Mm-hmm. That's a factor of over 10 to the 7 in the cost of keeping the ledger. And we're talking basically roughly 30 years, about a generation. So, for example, to go from a centralized ledger to a decentralized ledger, let's say you have 10 to the 5 nodes, which is more than enough. Monero, Bitcoin have way less than that. That means it's 100-fold increase in the cost of keeping the ledger. But now your cost goes down. You have 100,000 copies of the ledger, but the cost per copy goes down by 10 to the 7. Mm-hmm. So the net effect is a reduction in price by 10 to the 2, by 100-fold.
That's interesting.
That's kind of the perspective one has to take. So credit cards.
Is this a calculation that you just like kind of back of the napkin ran,
or napkin right now? You could do it, and you can go ahead as far as you want. I mean, you go back into the 50s.
I think even Satoshi himself, right, in the early days when he was on the forums, he was talking about basically technology catching up and making comparisons to, the fact that we couldn't run a video on our computer, and now we're right.
He understood. Satoshi understood that extremely well, which is why he was not concerned about scaling. The problem was, but you go back to the 1950s, and they're loading this 5 megabyte hard drive with a forklift onto one of the biggest planes at the time, one of the Electras or something, through a hatch. There's a picture of this. Oh, there's a picture of the IBM punch card repository of the U.S. government, which contained about half a gigabyte of data. It's in Wikipedia. They say 4 gigabytes, but they got it wrong. It's about half a gigabyte. And it was like a warehouse with rows and rows and rows of punch cards. And it's half a gigabyte.
Right. And I don't think a lot of people have. Yeah, I don't think a lot of people obviously don't have that perspective because they've only
Well,
they haven't seen the whole transition. They haven't been in tech.
Like the longer you've been around in tech, obviously, the longer that you're going to realize these things. But what I'm saying is that we're talking this huge growth, and it's no obvious end of it changing. Like we're talking about, like you've got a smartphone or you've got an SSD drive. That's 3-dimensional chips, not 2-dimensional chips. So Moore's law's right out of the equation because now we're going from a 2-dimensional chip to a 3-dimensional chip. Like
Oh wow! So you're saying Moore's law is really no longer a restriction at this
it's
point?
no longer applicable because it's Moore's law is just part of the equation. Like Moore's law started in the 1960s and it's probably ending around now. But we're moving to three-dimensional chips, which is actually means that you have far more densities, and you also have the CPU processing power is closer to the memory. Excuse me, which means that you're going to have even higher and higher computing rates. So, but look at bandwidth. I mean, people are putting fiber to the home all over the place. But don't be fooled by this. Fiber to the home, sure, the provider said we're going to go 300 megabits a second. I think it's capable way into the gigabits. Because basically what they did is they pushed copper to its maximum theoretical limit before they went and put fiber in. So, no, I see these trends continue. So that's where scaling is going to come from.
So what do you think Monero needs to be concentrating on? Monero as a community. So rather than running around with chickens without heads like everybody else in the crypto sphere saying, what are we going to do about scaling? And
I mean,
what should the focus be?
The focus is what it's doing right now. Yeah. Very, to be quite specific. I mean, it has to be what it's doing right now. Excuse me. You focus on the privacy, you focus on improving, but you have to realize that scaling is going to get taken care of by technology. There's nothing wrong with improving efficiency, which is what's going on. That's perfectly healthy. A lot of the focus on privacy and anonymity is right on the right track. So it's pretty much on the right track as a community. So just keep what we're doing. That's what I would say. I mean, I don't see a need for a fundamental change in the way the community is going. It's basically doing what it's supposed to be happening. Maybe it's a good thing we're not focusing on scaling, but scaling is going to get taken care of. So, but I think people are going to realize that it's taking care of itself.
How much longer do you think we're going to be doing these 6-month upgrades?
That's an interesting question because that goes back to the prior question: how fast is the protocol evolving? I don't know, but I think eventually it will not be as relevant. I expect basically because there isn't a need. It's going to happen as long as there's a need and as long as this product, there's improvements that are really beneficial to the community. And then it will continue to happen. Eventually, I think they might move to a point where the upgrades are relatively minimal and maybe they'll be spaced out. But the reason this is happening is because what's being presented to the community is a significant improvement in what Monero is as a cryptocurrency. That's why it's happening. And if that stops happening, the community is not going to go for it. So,
and how about in terms of using the 6-month upgrades to kind of stay ahead of the ASIC miners? Do you think that's a good approach? Do you think that's the right approach? It's necessary?
It'll buy us time. It's buying us time. But what is also happening right now is there's some very interesting work being done in developing adapted algorithms. And there's work being done by HYC. There's a lot of very interesting work in that area has been done. One of the I'm losing your light here, by the way. I don't know if you know.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the things that is happening is that there's a lot of work in the community, and that's also creating a lot of uncertainty to the prospective miners because there's a very strong support in the community against ASICs, which was much stronger than it was, say, a year ago. I mean, the community has been radicalized against ASICs, to put it bluntly. By the way the whole thing was introduced, by the way the ASICs were introduced, and so on. So I think someone trying to create an ASIC in Monero is facing much more, it's less a question of the technical issues, and more a question of the fact that you don't know what the community is going to do to put you out of business, basically. That's a huge uncertainty that's created. But yes, I think it's a lot of work in the community that it's going to make that no longer really needed. But it's happening. I can't predict what's going to happen. I just believe it's going to happen. There's a lot of very smart people looking at this problem right now in the community. I would not want to bet against them. This is what an ASIC manufacturer has to do.
What'd you think of the last fork where the ASICs kind of branched off and continued to mine the old coin? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I was one of the few members of the community that believed that that took the approach of feeding it to the bears, literally. And by that I mean dumping the thing, and I made some money on it. I don't make any bones. So there was a way to, at the time, can't be done now, but at the time there was a way to extract it without impacting the privacy of Monero. So you could basically create very large ring signatures, and then you could avoid you could have enough of an overlap that you have enough of an overlap that allows you to not disclose the key that was common. So you have essentially, in order to get around the privacy problem, what you have to do is you have to have enough fake fake inputs on both chains that are the same. If you have a big enough overlap, then you have an effective mixing of about 5 or 7 or something like that. So it could be done. So my opinion on it is that a multifaceted approach to response is best. Some people are going to say just ignore it. Some people are just going to dump it. And that worked fine. I think it was overestimated the impact and on the Monero chain. Samsung's work, Samsung Galaxy Player's work, is a worst case scenario, and it's more applicable, I think, to the actual fork chains themselves than it is to Monero because of the fact that there's a lot of transactions in Monero that are already spent, but which are unknown, so you can't expose. The technical issue, but basically the privacy. I think the privacy.
Hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
All right. So what do you think? Yeah. You got anything else big to talk about that's kind of happening behind the scenes in Core?
Well, what I can say that's happening is I think the big thing is going to happen right now, of course, is bulletproofs. Lowering transaction sizes by a factor of 5, lowering fees initially by a factor of 25, although in reality by a factor of 5 in real terms. That is going to be a very significant impact. I don't think we have seen that happen yet. I don't see the market really get what's happening there. So I think that's the big thing that's happening now in the pipeline right now. It's out there. It's out in the open. The code is on GitHub. But
yeah, no, it's very exciting.
It's extremely exciting. And I think I may answer the long-term scaling question. It may have at least put some debate. But I remain with my point of view. I think that Monero is one of the few viable coins. Very few coins that are viable to address the scaling problem. You know,
well, I guess one other thing back to ASICs was
yes,
the random, what is it called, random JS, that proposal that was been talked about. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's one of the possibilities that's out there. That is out there. I haven't really spent a lot of time looking at it myself because that's not my strongest area of expertise. I tend to focus on one element of the project primarily and then do a really good job on that rather than try to spread myself all over the place. But I trust on the people that are working on it. I think it may well be a part of the solution, this idea of changing the self-changing code, which is essentially what this is doing. So now the other thing about ASICs I should point out, we're going to be moving more and more towards more like a field programmable array scenario, FGPA kind of thing, with general purpose CPUs and GPUs. So it's going to be a change in there too. So you may see a lot of less advantage for the ASIC. The other thing about ASICs that I should make very clear, the problem with ASICs is not ASICs per se. It's that they're controlled by one entity because of how they're developed. If you commoditize the ASIC, then you're okay.
Right.
You don't care. So that's the other factor that could happen. If the thing just becomes a commodity, and effectively at that point in time, the motivation for fighting ASICs is fighting centralized control. That's the reason you want to fight ASICs.
Mm-hmm.
You turn them into a commodity, then it becomes less of an issue, or a non-issue at all.
Right, but that's just going to obviously take some time.
That will take time. So it's more, I think, gaining. It's, I think, more a question of buying time in this than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, Monero is in a very nice position. I mean, we're the largest GPU coin. Let's not kid ourselves. Ethereum is already heavily being mined by ASICs. And anybody who tells you otherwise is deluding themselves.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of kind of like these botnets and things that are being used to mine Monero?
Botnets, I think were more of a factor, say, in 2015 than they are today.
Mm-hmm.
There's a limit of what you could do with a botnet, because what happens with a botnet is you sort of infect, you kind of max it out, and there's no advantage to, and if you then get there's no real advantage to grow it after you hit this max point.
Mm-hmm.
And keep in mind, botnets are also competing all sorts of criminal activities. They're not just mining cryptocurrency, and it's the kind of activity that easily gives you away. I mean, all of a sudden, all the computers start generating a lot of heat and they're going flat out, that you got given away. So there's only so much you can do with botnets. So I don't see that as a dominant factor in mining at all right now. I think it was more of a dominant factor maybe about 2 to 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
From that perspective, it's than it is today.
Okay.
It's only so much you can grow with a botnet before you're basically maxed it out.
Do you think Monero is kind of already fundamentally more distributed than Bitcoin is in terms of the way it's being mined?
Absolutely. Because we've actually the largest GPU CPU coin. I think Ethereum had that role for a while, but Ethereum is being mined by ASICs. There's a lot of denial, but that's happening. Same can be said for some of the other proof of work coins. If you're the largest GPU CPU coin, that's a very nice position to be from a decentralization perspective. And I think what Monero is going for it, and I'm going to emphasize this, is the community has created so much uncertainty. The threat is, I think I made a comment and read about this. The threat is greater than its execution. It's a very famous grandmaster called Aaron Nimzovich said this. And this is what's happening here, is that the threat of what the community is going to do to the ASIC manufacturers is deterring it more than anything else. So there is so much going on that if you're an ASIC manufacturer, you say, wait a minute, I'm going to get left up hanging cold and dry here. So that, I think, is what's doing it. It's just put Monero in a very strong position. I mean, I'm sounding like a Monero maximalist. I hate to say this, but I've lost your sound. I'm still losing sound. Not getting your sound.
How about now?
Yeah, now you got it.
Okay. I think a lot of people are starting to listen to these things that you're talking about, and even Bitcoin maximalists, I think, which is another question I have. I mean, do you see Bitcoin maximalists or even people in the developer world kind of taking Monero more seriously now? Well,
they already are. A lot of people are. There's a lot more interest. There's a lot of people that work for there are developers in Bitcoin that look at Monero. The thing about Monero is a couple of things. First of all, it's not just the developer world; it's also in the exchanges. It's because it didn't follow the Bitcoin protocol. It's also harder to, if you want to start an exchange and you want to add Monero, it's a lot more work than if you want to add, say, for example, Zcash or Dash. It's a lot more effort. So that's been a downside for Monero. But I think with time, more and more people are looking. We have a very strong developer community. We have a very strong. There's also a lot of people in the periphery of the developer community of Monero. So there's a lot of seriousness. And quite honestly, if you want to look something different than Bitcoin in a proof of work cryptocurrency, there aren't that many choices.
But are we pulling over some of the like Bitcoin Core guys? Are they starting to think about?
They've been contributing.
Working for Monero, like contributing to Monero?
They've been contributing. There's been other people in the Bitcoin core that has been contributing to Monero. Oh yeah, there's contributions from that area, absolutely. And that's a good thing. It's a healthy thing.
What do you think of the kind of, everybody always says, if Bitcoin fails, then they all fail. The experiment of cryptocurrency as a whole fails. Do you think that's a true statement?
I don't agree with it, but there's a danger. But I think there's a bit of perception there because we're still very small. I mean, Monero is basically right now about about 1.5% the size of Bitcoin, something like that. So Bitcoin's already failed. I don't kid you. If you read the Satoshi paper, Bitcoin was designed as a peer-to-peer cash that can be used electronically. It has failed at that. There's been a lot of work to keep its value by turning it into a store of value, a first layer for second layer solutions, and that's fine. I mean, they've helped preserve the value of Bitcoin. But if you look at the Satoshi paper, and this is right, if I want to suggest people read the Satoshi paper carefully. It's 10 years old. It's going to be 10 years old in a few months. Because it tells you why Bitcoin was created in the first place. That task, unfortunately, I do not believe that Bitcoin can handle the task it was set out by Satoshi. And Monero has a realistic chance of that. That's all I can say. And the reason is, when it comes back to the scaling, but to my opinion, I mean, 2012, I remember when there were stores in Vancouver, you could walk into a restaurant in Vancouver, have a meal, and pay for it in Bitcoin. That's not happening anymore.
Well, yeah, everybody claims now it's digital gold, and there's no reason to spend it.
But the reason is that they have to find an alternative use for it because it cannot be used as a transactional currency because it doesn't have, the blockchain doesn't support that. So you find a different use or a different application or to preserve its value. I mean, that's what's been done. That's the reason it has value. So some people are willing to accept that. I'm not convinced that it can function as digital gold. Maybe it can. I mean, Bitcoin is competitive at this point in one area, and that is as a transactional, sort of a reserve currency for crypto, because people buy Bitcoin to buy other things. Like, for example, if I'm selling Monero for CAD or buying Monero with CAD, it's a good chance I have to go through Bitcoin. So, but if that use gets eliminated, that sort of reserve currency use, as I think probably, then that's also going to have an impact on the Bitcoin price. And that's only going to happen as currencies like Monero get more and more exchange exposure.
Right, and wouldn't Monero then just become the coin that's also used for the store of value at that point because of the fact that it's being used as a currency? So now it has more network effect, it has more underlying value, and then just the fact that it's fungible. I mean, I always thought of gold as being a fungible asset. I
would say yes. Fungibility is a very interesting point. I mean, it's a bit of an aside, but the US dollar is fast becoming unfungible. And I'm not talking about cash US dollars. I'm talking about the digital version because they're two different currencies, very different currencies. For example, in the European Union, Russia and China, they're getting together to bypass the US dollar over Iran, which means to bypass the SWIFT system and so on. So that's an example where fungibility has a real impact. And it will have an impact on the value of the US dollar because people are going to move away from the US dollar as a reserve currency because of this. So we've seen this dollar there. So fungibility would definitely make Monero more reasonable. In theory, the justification for value of a currency is actually its transactional use, which then gives it its value as a so-called digital gold. Gold is where it was because it was used as a transactional currency, and it functioned as a transactional currency. That's why gold is valuable, and it still is. And Bitcoin doesn't have that. I don't think it has the amount of history to justify that, to transition so fast into sort of a digital gold. So I would argue that it could well be that Monero could give Bitcoin a run for the money on the digital gold side. The one negative, people think was Monero's got inflation. It's got this 1% per year inflation. Well, that's less than the inflation rate of gold. But it's a perception that it is in there, which is, I think, what's keeping the fixed maximum number of coins with value. Why did Ethereum Classic go from a fixed minimum block reward to a fixed maximum number of coins? Well, I'll tell you why. My real suspicion is because the hedge fund managers told them, hey, you need to do this in order to sell Ethereum Classic. So that's the reason.
And I mean, and then the whole point is kind of moot anyway. I mean, if you can't run a blockchain, because if the architecture doesn't work, and you need that tail emission, then it doesn't matter what the economics say, right? Yes, I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, it would be great if we could have this completely fixed digital asset. But I think what we're saying is that that's not really feasible, right? Given the
correct, yes.
Given the way these architectures work, you need miners to mine, and you need the network to be secure, and it doesn't work without a mining reward.
Well, you need a mining reward to incentivize the proof of work, and you cannot rely on fees to do that. And that's there's a huge amount of denial in the Bitcoin community about this, but not just in Bitcoin, but a whole bunch of other coins like Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash, even Dash, etc. Zcash. They all have the same historical concept that we're going to follow Bitcoin on this. That's what puts Monero in such a unique position, because it's not just Bitcoin, it's all the other possible ones are also in the same situation.
Was there anything else you talked about? I know you did a talk at DEF CON, right?
Yes, I did.
Was that basically the essence? You were talking about the dynamic block size and the economics of it? Or, I mean, the tail emission? Or
yeah, I did spend a fair amount of time on some of the more specific examples of what are considered protocols, and by that I mean in business models. And one of the things that, for example, would have been credit cards. The business model for credit cards was designed in 1949, and the first credit card, well, it was launched in 1950. The Diners Club had a 7% merchant fee. Today, as a Canadian, if I go to the States and buy gasoline with my Canadian credit card, my effective fee is 7%. Even though we have had order 10 to the 12 and the cost of keeping the ledger, processing transaction essentially plunging, the business model hasn't changed. It was designed for the technology of the 1940s, where it made sense to charge 7% because how much it costs to process these things using hand calculators and tabulating machines and punch cards and so on. But the business model has survived while the technology has drastically changed. So what do you have today? You have all the merchants are complaining that they're paying too much to the credit card. Well, of course they are. So I'm a restaurant and more money goes into paying the credit card that I'm making. So that, if I was going to leave a comment about this, it's business models and protocols don't change. Technology changes. And that's the key message if I was going to send a message on this.
Right, saying, well, credit cards weren't designed for the digital age.
They were designed for the 1940s, based on the technology of the 1940s. But the business models have remained today, and they're no longer functional. The business model of charging the merchant to incentivize the sale concept, which is how credit cards basically function.
Right. And that business model doesn't make sense in this day and age where we're all on the internet and transacting on the internet.
Well, that's correct. And in fact, the credit card industry has yet to figure out after a quarter of a century how to do secure transactions on the internet. They do not have the system they have online on the internet is based on minimizing the probability of risk. It is not a secure system because you're using publicly available information about people to process credit cards.
Well, what do you think about like the Venmos of the world and the PayPals that are essentially allowing you to transact instantly and for free?
They're not allowing you to transact instantly and for free. PayPal charges the merchant. It's comparable to any other merchant product, 3-4%, depending on the transaction. So it's definitely not free. Because the trouble with PayPal is they're built on top of the credit card industry. So PayPal could transition to crypto in the sense that if they were to and lower the fees and were to move to transact in cryptocurrency, so that is an option for them. But right now, as they're basically another payment processor because they're stuck on top of this infrastructure.
And I guess Venmo, the argument would be, if it seems like it's free, then you're probably the product.
Well, that could be also the issue. The other problem, of course, is that you're getting into the question of people selling the information, and that's a huge issue for consumers. It's going to come even more and more. We see what's happening in Europe with general data protection legislation and regulations. That's huge. I mean, companies like Facebook are going to face, they're going to hit from every direction over this. So my argument is these type of products are still stuck on top of the old system. So what you want is a small transaction fee. I mean, the only way you can do it for free is if you actually subsidize it through seniorage, which is in effect what Monero is doing and what Cash historically did. And that means that on very low cost is that in Monero with a tail emission, you use seniorage to pay for the mining fees, which is exactly what Cash historically did. You know, you'd have a silver coin, and the Roman Empire would put the stamp of the emperor on it, and initially it was 2 or 3%, and then they got greedy and debased it. But that small stamp told people how much silver there was in there, and so therefore they could trust it. And the seniorage is the little percentage that went back to pay for that. So that's how you do it for free. You have a hidden inflation, basically, a small amount of inflation, which is what Monero does. That's how you could do it. Can you do it through the fees? I think in Monero will become very low. The primary purpose of fees in Monero is to deter spam, actually, as opposed to fund anything. It's just to deter attacks. But what happens is if the block size increase, the fees per transaction fall proportionately, so it'll be very, very low.
Sounds like a good design to me.
Like I said, I think it's the strongest design right there on the market today. And I do not say that lightly.
All right. I think we should maybe end on that point.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Thank you very much for taking the time.
You're very welcome.
I apologize. I didn't have a perfect studio over here today. Some interruptions.
I have to get around my issues with proprietary software such as Chrome.
Okay.
Like, okay, you have to do this and this and this and jump through all these hoops just to communicate with somebody. Well, there's something wrong with that.
Yep. But I would love to be able to reach out to you again in the future and have you back on.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah. So, well,
thank you very much, Francisco. It was a pleasure talking with you. And good luck with everything. Hope to talk to you again in the future.
You can take care.
All right. Bye.